In September 1873, one of America's most powerful bankers, Jay Cooke, declared bankruptcy after failing to repay maturing bonds. The news quickly reached the New York Stock Exchange and triggered a massive collapse in stock prices. At the time, Britain's major banks had invested enormous sums into the American railroad industry, and as a result, the financial fire soon spread across the Atlantic to Britain itself. The Victorian era, which had once surged confidently toward the peak of industrial glory, was suddenly struck by crisis and entered a prolonged depression that lasted 22 years. But unlike the catastrophic global economic collapse of the 1930s, Britain's Long Depression was defined less by total financial ruin and more by the sharp decline of agricultural prices. This transformation brought an end to Britain's agricultural dominance and reshuffled the country's landowning class. Yet, amid the steady economic decline, advances in refrigerated transport, and the rapid growth of the food industry, combined with endless shipments of cheap grain from the New World, unexpectedly created an era of abundance on British dining tables. The food was often bland and inexpensive, but it was plentiful. During this period, Britain largely abandoned the dream of agricultural self-sufficiency and instead began embracing the benefits brought by the globalization of industrial food production. Whiter bread, cheaper sources of protein, and sweeter afternoon tea gradually came together and quietly reshaped the British diet. In the end, these changes laid the foundation for what we now recognize as modern British cuisine. And today, that is the story we are about to explore. During the Long Depression, as British agriculture slid deeper into collapse, wheat imported from the United States became one of the most important pillars supporting the British diet. Ironically, before the Depression, finely milled white flour had largely been a symbol of the middle class, while ordinary people relied more on coarse black bread and mixed grain cakes made with bran and cheaper cereals. But after the railroad network across the American Midwest was fully completed in the 1870s, and with steam cargo ships crossing the Atlantic more frequently than ever before, imported wheat suddenly became available at prices nearly half that of domestic grain, sometimes even lower. On the dining tables of Britain's growing industrial cities, white bread gradually lost its status as a class symbol and instead became a basic necessity for survival. This transformation greatly eased many of the social tensions caused by the Long Depression. Even as industrial profits shrank, the purchasing power of British workers actually improved to a certain degree. Historians later described the era as poison for farmers, but a feast for workers, and the phrase fit perfectly. As food costs declined and the Engel coefficient dropped, the invisible hand of the market continued reshaping British eating habits. Since families were now spending far less money on staple foods, more of their income began flowing towards secondary foods and cheap prepared meals. Affordable sugar helped fuel the booming jam industry, while the newly developed margarine industry paired perfectly with white bread and quickly became a household staple. But perhaps the most significant change brought by imported wheat was the rise of rich flour-based comfort foods. Because flour was dry, easy to store, and ideal for mass production, Britain saw the rapid spread of hearty dishes that combined flour, fat, gravy, and meat into dense filling meals for industrial workers. Among the earliest and most influential examples was the steak and kidney pie, a future icon of British cuisine that had been refined since the mid-18th century by wrapping cheap cuts of pork, beef, or lamb kidneys inside flaky pastry before slowly steaming or baking them. Another famous working-class dish was the Lancashire meat pudding, especially popular in textile towns like Lancashire and Oldham, where minced lamb and onions were sealed inside dough and steamed for hours. Because these puddings were often wrapped in cloth while cooking, people also nicknamed them rag puddings. For British workers at the time, both dishes were ideal lunches. They looked simple, stayed warm for long hours, were inexpensive, extremely filling, and packed with rich fatty flavors that could sustain labor through exhausting factory shifts. Meanwhile, in London, one of the most common working-class lunches was the Savoy sausage, served with bread and gravy. Savoy sausages were made primarily from pork mixed with breadcrumbs, potato starch, lard, and spices, and were famous for their striking bright red color. Traditional London-style preparation involved boiling the sausage before placing it inside bread, alongside mashed peas and thick gravy, then finishing the dish with a heavy spoonful of mustard. In the end, under the relentless flood of cheap American wheat, traditional British staples such as oats, rye, and barley slowly faded from daily life. In their place, quick and convenient wheat bread became dominant, and the practice of slicing bread open and filling it with cold meat, cheese, bacon, or jam gradually evolved into the sandwich culture that would become the standard working class lunch across Britain. To be honest, few foods in British culinary history have experienced a fate as complicated as the potato. Introduced from the New World in the late 16th century as an exotic curiosity, it was later dismissed as a suspicious devil's crop, then became a lifeline for the Irish and cheap military rations during the Napoleonic Wars. By the 19th century, however, the potato had finally shaken off much of the prejudice surrounding it and transformed into one of the essential fuels powering industrial society. Then, when the Long Depression arrived, the potato underwent one final dramatic transformation and rose into one of the most beloved stars of the British table. On the surface, the reasons seemed obvious. Potatoes were nutritious, productive, and inexpensive. But the deeper reason was that their unique properties made them almost the perfect industrial-era food filler, capable of adapting to nearly every style of mass cooking. Unlike bread, potatoes required almost no equipment to prepare. Tossed directly into hot ashes or a fire, they could be cooked with ease. As a result, freshly baked potatoes became one of the most popular street foods across Britain's cities. Better still, once roasted, they retained heat for a long time. During the freezing winters, laborers often carried a hot baked potato inside their coats, warming their hands while eating on the move. It became an unspoken survival trick shared by workers everywhere. At the same time, the dense cellular structure of potatoes made them especially suitable for frying. Their surfaces crisped quickly into a golden crust, while the inside remained moist and soft, creating a perfect contrast between crunchy salt-coated exteriors and fluffy interiors. And no dish showcased this quality better than the legendary fish and chips. Potatoes also contained enormous amounts of absorbent starch. Simply boiling and mashing a few potatoes with water, milk, and margarine could produce a massive bowl of mashed potatoes. During difficult economic times, this ability to make meals appear larger was practically a required skill for every housewife in Britain. One of the classic meals built around mashed potatoes became especially popular in London's East End, where workers loved pie and mash, a combination many locals considered one of the finest foods in the world. Families with slightly more money would often add a serving of stewed eel as well. European eels could survive in the filthy, oxygen-starved waters of the Thames, and after being simmered into broth and cooled, the dish naturally thickened into a jelly-like texture that became a signature part of working-class London cuisine. Meanwhile, in the English Midlands, mashed potatoes found another companion in the byproducts of Britain's growing pork industry. Factory leftovers and unwanted pig organs were minced together with herbs and breadcrumbs, then wrapped in caul fat and baked into savory faggots, a traditional pork meatball dish. Near factory districts, small takeaway shops would prepare huge batches of these meatballs alongside gravy and mountains of mashed potatoes, allowing exhausted workers to buy hot, inexpensive dinners on their way home. According to popular descriptions of the time, the most remarkable thing about faggots was their rich texture, which some people claimed resembled duck meat. In 19th century Britain, fatty ducks with long growth cycles were expensive luxury foods, so the idea that humble pork offal could imitate such a flavor felt almost miraculous. It was practically Britain's own version of imitation crab. Finally, another advantage of potatoes was how perfectly they worked in long, slow-cooked stews. During the Long Depression, canned meats and frozen imported beef became major sources of protein for ordinary Britons. Although affordable, these meats were often tough and lacking in flavor compared to fresh cuts. Potatoes solved the problem beautifully by absorbing grease, balancing flavors, and naturally thickening broths into rich, hearty meals. One of the most famous dishes born from this logic was Liverpool stew, a meal already beloved by sailors during the Age of Sail. As one of the world's largest ports in the 19th century, Liverpool was among the first cities hit hard by economic decline. Dock workers responded by simmering cheap frozen beef, or sometimes even bare bones, together with huge amounts of potatoes until the potatoes completely dissolved into the broth. The resulting stew became thick, almost like paste, before being seasoned and served with cabbage and rough stale bread. Even the poorest table could suddenly feel warm and comforting. Another famous dish was Lancashire hot pot. Much like Lancashire pudding before it, the dish reflected the industrial culture of the region. But this time, instead of dough, thin slices of potato became the main companion to lamb. The potatoes were layered across the top like fish scales, while large cuts of lamb rested underneath. Unlike ordinary stovetop stews, Lancashire hot pot had to be cooked slowly inside an oven for many hours. By the late 19th century, it became a classic working family meal, prepared before leaving for work in the morning and finally ready to eat after returning home at night. Like so many British foods that emerged during the Long Depression, its rise reflected a society struggling to adapt to a harsh industrial world. Beneath the gray atmosphere of economic hardship, ordinary people were experimenting with new ways to balance market supply, limited income, and exhausting factory schedules while searching for something simple, yet deeply human. A way to eat well, stay full, and endure. If you had lived through Britain's Long Depression, surviving on white bread, mashed potatoes, thick stews, and fish and chips, which meal do you think would have become your comfort food? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden history behind the foods that shaped entire civilizations, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Because sometimes, the story of a nation is not written on battlefields or inside palaces, but quietly waiting on an ordinary dinner table